Hello, everyone, and welcome to Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. I'm your host, Don Murphy. Our topic today is the hope and heartbreak of Angel Island Immigration Station. Never heard of it? Well, you probably have heard of Ellis Island in New York Harbor, with the Statue of Liberty welcoming mostly European immigrants to America. Well, Angel Island, located in San Francisco Bay, is also known as the Ellis Island of the West, where hundreds of thousands of Asians and Pacific Islanders were detained before being able to enter the United States. With us today to tell us the story of hope and heartbreak is Edward DePorn. Edward is the executive director of the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation. The immigration station is located within Angel Island State Park. Ed joined the Immigration Station Foundation team in November of 2019. He has over 25 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. He previously served on staff at the Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum for nearly 16 years. Ed received a BA in biology and psychology from Washington University. He was also a Nelson Mandela Scholarship recipient in the Masters of Social Work program at the George Warren Brown School of Social Work. He is a certified professional leadership coach. In 2019, Ed was awarded a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Award for Health Equity. He is currently a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Culture of Health Fellow. Ed, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much, Don. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, let's back up and go to that, the fact that Angel Island is often referred to as the Ellis Island of the West. I think everybody's familiar with Ellis Island as an immigration station, but not as many people are as familiar with Angel Island. So tell us about Angel Island, where it is, how it became perhaps the Ellis Island of the West, and exactly what your involvement is. Tell us about yourself and how you got involved with Angel Island.
Sure thing. So Angel Island, for folks who aren't familiar with where it's located, is actually the largest island in the San Francisco Bay Area. And the island sits on the ancestral lands of the Coast Miwok. It was colonized by Mexico, and then in the mid-1800s, it was transferred from Mexico to the US. We know that part of the history of immigration to the US and part of how it's connected to Angel Island is that after the discovery of gold in California, many Chinese laborers sought new lives and new opportunities and made their way to the US to work on the gold mines. Unfortunately, once the gold rush ended, they had to find new opportunities to stay here in the US. And so many of them then moved on to helping to build the Transcontinental Railroad. What we often don't hear is that after that Transcontinental Railroad was finished, the Chinese laborers were not allowed to actually ride it and had to walk their ways or find other ways back to the West Coast where they were hoping to resettle. And unfortunately, once they returned to those towns and cities across the West Coast, they were met with a lot of racism and xenophobia. Unfortunately, at the time, our country was undergoing some economic challenges and the job market was a little tough. And so these Chinese laborers were seen as a threat to economy, as seen as taking jobs away from Americans in the US. And as I think about those themes, it is really similar to some of the things that we hear about immigrants who come to the US today. So unfortunately, there was a lot of arson, there was muggings, there was lynchings that were targeted towards the Chinese who were here. And that violence, that discrimination made its way into our nation's immigration policies as well. So starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that represented the first time in our nation's history that the laborers from a specific country, as well as its people, were barred from entering and barred from becoming US citizens. With that, the US decided that they needed an immigration station, much like Ellis Island on the East Coast, to be able to process and handle the immigrants who were trying to enter the US. But Angel Island actually was a different type of immigration station compared to Ellis Island, whereas Ellis Island and the Statue of Liberty are really beautiful symbols of how our nation has welcomed immigrants, particularly those from Europe. Angel Island's immigration station was built with the specific intention of processing Asians to try to keep them out. And it also served as a detention center where immigrants spent days, weeks, months, all the way on up to 2 years as they fought for their right to enter the US.
Well, what about the workers and the Chinese that were already in America? Were they deported to Angel Island? Were they forced to leave the mainland and go to the island until they could be processed and then allowed into the country?
Not to my knowledge, if they were already here, unless there was some sort of process or serving to them, they weren't necessarily moved to or deported to Angel Island until after Angel Island was built. Then in those cases, when people were leaving the country, whether it was for tourism or to take a trip back, then Angel Island was the immigration station where people entered and exited. There were other immigration stations on the West Coast in Los Angeles as well as Seattle, but Angel Island was definitely the largest and had the most activity.
So when the gold rush happened and the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and people of Asian descent were welcomed to the country to be laborers, they were allowed to stay in the country and establish a life here. They weren't forced to leave, that because that's not always clear to some people, that there was a community that was here during the gold rush that lasted through the gold rush, and Chinese communities in particular were established in San Francisco and in Los Angeles and Seattle. And those communities suffered, of course, from racism and xenophobia, but they also thrived.
They thrived. And so for the laborers who were here for the gold rush, as well as the Transcontinental Railroad, they were seen as a source of cheap labor. And particularly the building of that railroad, we have to remember that those were dangerous jobs that involved dynamite and explosives. And many of the laborers lost their lives in the building of that railroad.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Angel Island in particular and its preservation and the work that you do there with the foundation. How did you get involved? What's your background? And you're of Asian descent. Where did your family come from?
So my grandparents immigrated from China to Thailand on both sides of my family back in the 1920s and 30s. So my connections are not directly to Angel Island, unlike others whose ancestors from China came to the US. My ancestors went from China to Thailand. My parents were the first on both sides that had the opportunity to go to college. And so my father became a medical technologist. My mom became a nurse. And after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1965 here in the US, which created new pathways for immigration for what were termed highly skilled workers, that was the window of opportunity for my parents to come to the US in the early 1970s. They, like many immigrants, those who came through Angel Island as well as afterwards, came with the hopes of new opportunities, of prosperity, of being able to send money back home to support all of our family back home. And what they faced instead was the reality of how difficult it is often for immigrants who come to the US to feel a sense of belonging, to navigate new cultures, to navigate a new language. And we settled in Texas, which back in the 70s and 80s was not as diverse or perhaps as accepting as it is now. Those experiences for me as an immigrant growing up, I was actually born in Bangkok, Thailand, and came here when I was about a year and a half old. Growing up in Texas and seeing how my parents were treated because they spoke English with an accent, with my own experiences of being treated as different and other, for me, those instilled a set of personal values around respect and fairness and treating people the way that I wanted to be treated. One early story that I have from elementary school was there's a week where we all got to go to an outdoor education camp. And that was the week that everyone looked forward to because you were away from your parents and outside of the classroom. And I remember once we arrived at that outdoor education camp, they assembled all of us on the field and they started calling out our cabin assignments. And all of my white friends were placed into one set of cabins, and all the people of color, students like me, were placed into another set of cabins. And that was one of my early childhood experiences of recognizing that as an Asian, as an immigrant, I was seen as different from many of my friends.
Even though you were an American citizen.
At the time, I actually wasn't an American citizen. I was a permanent resident, but I'd been here in the US at that time for 9, 10 years. And so it definitely is one of those things that I think many immigrants experience coming to the US is that desire, not only for new opportunities, but that desire to fit in. And also at the same time, that desire to preserve the connections and roots and family ties to our home countries. And so oftentimes we feel like we're split between two different worlds and never fully belonging to one. But it's those experiences as an immigrant that drew me to Angel Island. Most of my professional career has actually been in public health and in public health advocacy. And I tend to take a very broad definition of what health looks like for an individual, for a family, for a community. It's not just about access to healthcare services. It's not just about public health, but it's also the environments that we live in, the communities that we live in, how our different identities, how our immigration status might impact our health. And so when I saw the job position for an executive director at Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, it fit in with me in terms of thinking about this very broad view of health and how immigration is a huge part of how we get treated, both from a policy perspective as well as from a community perspective. And with everything that we were starting to see happening in the US, where there was increasing racism, increasing xenophobia, it felt like an important place to be able to help lift up the history of Angel Island and how we've treated immigrants in the past, but also to be able to draw those connections to how we are treating immigrants today and how we might want to treat immigrants into the future.
What's the reaction of the visitors in that regard when they come to the immigration station? I know I've spent a lot of time at Ellis Island as well in my capacity as Deputy Director of the National Park Service, and I've seen the reactions. I've seen how people are fascinated, moved to tears, find a sense of purpose and connection with their ancestors. Is it the same way at Angel Island when both the general public visits and perhaps ancestors of Asian Americans who may have been detained at Angel Island?
There are a couple of different reactions that people have when they visit Angel Island, and a lot of it does depend on their own personal family histories and experiences. Definitely for those who were detained on Angel Island, there are only a handful of those former detainees who are still alive, but I've had the privilege of accompanying some of those former detainees out to the island, and for them to relive those moments, the traumas and injustices they've experienced, it's very moving. And it was such a traumatic experience for many of these detainees that they actually didn't even talk about their experiences with their own families, and their families would find out later that their grandfather or grandmother or their father or mother had been detained at Angel Island. For the descendants, for the family members of those detainees, it's definitely very emotional knowing that this is something that your relative endured. And then for others, I think my hope is that for anyone who is an immigrant or is of immigrant heritage, that when they visit Angel Island, they feel the same sense of connection to Angel Island that they do when they visit Ellis Island, because both islands do represent the bookends of the immigrant experience here in the US, where perhaps Ellis Island represents the hope and the welcoming, but it's also important to remember that there's a period in time where our nation actively tried to keep certain groups out and perhaps is doing that again. And so what Angel Island's visitors have the opportunity to do is to literally walk in the footsteps of history, to walk in the hallways and in the detention barracks where immigrants were detained for weeks and months, And it's especially poignant because carved into the walls of the detention barracks are over 200 poems that were written by the Chinese detainees. And those poems truly do capture the essence of their traumas, their experiences, of their emotions. And they represent a mixed set of the hope of coming to a new country, the despair and desperation of being confined in a detention barracks, the uncertainty of not knowing how long they would be held. And so it's that mix of emotions that I think gets mirrored in the emotions that visitors to Angel Island experience when they come and visit.
Well, you mentioned the poetry that was on the walls, and in fact, it was the discovery of the writing on the walls of the immigration station at Angel Island by a state park ranger. And I should mention and give some context here that Angel Island is a state park, and one of the first rangers at Angel Island was Alex Weiss, who, may he rest in peace, is now deceased, but was a wonderful individual. I got to know him during my tenure with California State Parks. He actually discovered or rediscovered the writing on the wall, and from that rediscovery of the writing on the wall, writings on the wall, if you will, the poetry, that lit a spark, as you said earlier, that started a huge fire in the hearts and minds of many people to make sure that the history of the Angel Island immigration station was preserved. Can you tell us a little bit about that history, and then what happened from the discovery of that poetry that led to the preservation, not only as a state park, but then as a state historical monument, and then as a national historical monument?
The fire actually has a multi-time history with Angel Island State Park. So it was a fire in the administration building in 1940 that led to the sites to cease. So fire has a long history with Angel Island, and fire in the administration building in 1940 is what led to the site being ending its service as a U.S. immigration station. And though there were other buildings that were still standing, for example, the detention barracks and the hospital, because those buildings were still standing, the U.S. Army took the site back over and used the site during World War II to hold enemy POWs from Germany, Italy, and Japan, as well as to temporarily detain over 700 Japanese Americans immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And after World War II, the site was abandoned by the Army. It fell into disrepair and disarray, and finally came under the stewardship of California State Parks in the mid-1950s. And there were originally plans to tear down the buildings at Angel Island's immigration station to make way for new campsites and new picnic table areas. But luckily, Ranger Weiss had heard these rumors that there were poems carved into the walls. And he, as you know, Don, rediscovered, he went into these buildings with a flashlight and saw these beautiful carvings etched into the walls. And he happened to mention it to one of his professors, who then helped to galvanize a Pan-Asian group of activists, organizers, and academics who recognized the importance of these poems and this site to not only Asian American history, but also to California history and to US history. And that began this multi-year process of first securing California historical landmark status for the site to try to preserve its buildings. Ultimately, we were successful in working with California State Parks in California's legislature to preserve the site, to allocate funds to help to ensure that the buildings remain standing. And then that movement just continued to grow to the point where in 1997, we were able to secure National Historic Landmark status for the site. And it really is a testament to the hard work of so many community members, so many representatives and leaders from California State Parks and other institutions, that these buildings buildings are still around and that people have the opportunity to still visit these places that really are an important part of America's psyche and conscience that unfortunately many are not aware of. I know growing up in Houston, Texas, I never learned about Angel Island in school. Even coming out to the Bay Area, it wasn't until a few years in that I learned that there was this national treasure right in our own backyard. And so the hope that we have at the foundation is that every single child and adult in the US recognizes the history of Angel Island in the same way that they're taught about Ellis Island and what it represents to the country, and that people make that trip out to Angel Island because it's a beautiful site, the nature there, the sense of history there, and there's just no replacement for being out on the island, walking on the site itself to be able to not only learn about history, but also to feel that history.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a example of how recreational opportunities and history come together in our park system. You mentioned earlier about the health and well-being of people being connected to their history, their heritage, and of course also to nature. And I think Angel Island is one of the greatest representations where you can go and get that kind of experience in one place, because I mean, people do everything from kayak around the island to hike its recreational trails to come out on a Saturday or Sunday and picnic. It's a wonderful place. And now, of course, there's a museum there. Can you tell us a little bit about the status of the museum?
We have worked very hard over the past 40 years at the foundation to help preserve the site, as well as to help interpret the site and to create exhibits and museum buildings that help to bring this history to life. So in 1979, the site opened to the public, and that was the first instance where we were able to put some exhibits to help translate this experience that immigrants had. Over subsequent decades, we were able to raise both private funds as well as public funds from the state of California, as well as from Congress, to engage in a multi-million-dollar renovation to preserve the former detention barracks where immigrants were held and to install exhibits into that building. That happened back in 2009. And since then, the main focus has been on preserving and restoring the former hospital building on the site. Mm-hmm. So the hospital building was in a tremendous sense of decay. There was one wall internally that was only attached to the roof. It wasn't attached to the floor, and it wasn't attached to any other walls. And we happen to be in earthquake country here at Angel Island. And if the ground had shook a certain way, or if a storm had come in and that wall had gone down, the entire building would have potentially gone down with it. So we've just completed a 7-year, $15 million process of preserving that building, making sure it's still standing, and reimagining it as a new museum building that we've called the Angel Island Immigration Museum. And what I'm very excited about AIM, which is the acronym for the new museum, is that it allows us to diversify the stories and exhibits that we tell at Angel Island. The detention barracks is full of wonderful stories that talk about the experience of, well, not wonderful, but important stories to remember about the experiences of detention and exclusion and these parts of our California and US history that more people should be aware of. But it can sometimes be hard to convince someone to come out to visit a site that's focused just on detention, that's only focused on the darker chapters in our history. And so what the Angel Island Immigration Museum allows us to do is to still continue to tell these stories of exclusion and detention, and to expand them beyond Angel Island, to connect them to, for example, what is happening on the southern border today. But also inside the new museum building, we have exhibits that celebrate the strengths and resiliencies and contributions of immigrants, both those who came through Angel Island as well as those who came afterwards. For those who happen to be familiar with Angel Island, they think of Angel Island sometimes as just a Chinese immigrant detention center. And it's absolutely true that the majority of the 300,000 people who were detained at Angel Island were of Chinese descent. We estimate that about 175,000 of the detainees were Chinese, followed by Japanese, South Asian, Russian, Germans. Those were some of the largest groups of detainees at Angel Island. But in actuality, people from over 80 different countries pass through Angel Island in their attempts to enter the US. And it's part of those more diverse histories that we try to lift up in the Angel Island Immigration Museum, so that regardless of where you have immigrated from in the world, those experiences of feeling different, of trying to fit in, but also being a contributor to our new homes. Those are some of the themes that I'm happy we've been able to incorporate into the exhibits within the Angel Island Immigration Museum.
So, did the majority of people who pass through Angel Island actually pass through and end up on the mainland in the United States?
It really depends. Many of the original exclusionary laws were targeted directly at the Chinese, so the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. But then what we saw in the decade or two that followed was those exclusion laws that were targeted to the Chinese were widened, so that ultimately they impacted almost anyone who came from an Asian Pacific Islander country, unless that country happened to be a territory of the US. And so for those folks who cross the Pacific Ocean to Angel Island, what would often happen is that the immigration officials would meet the ocean liner in San Francisco Bay. If you were traveling in first or second class, the immigration officials would conduct a very cursory screening as well as medical exam in the privacy of your own cabins. And in most cases, if they believed that you were who you said you were, then you were allowed to disembark immediately into San Francisco. So there were a couple of exclusions to the Chinese Exclusion Act. If you were a businessman, if you were an academic, if you were someone of means and wealth, then and the immigration officials believe that, then more often than not, you could just depart directly. But if they questioned whether you were who you said you were, if they questioned whether or not you might have one of the list of excludable medical conditions, then you were then placed on to a ferry that brought you to Angel Island. And so we know that if in particular, the immigration officials were targeting Asians and Pacific Islanders, but there definitely were people from other parts of the world who were forced to go to Angel Island for processing. The typical experience for those who were non-Asians, though, was that it was maybe a couple of days, perhaps a week, that they might have spent on Angel Island. That in comparison to Ellis Island, which was really meant to quickly process European immigrants. And so immigrants from Europe who came through Ellis Island would typically only spend a couple of hours on Ellis Island before they were allowed in. For Asian immigrants, though, that process of detention could last up to 2 years. The longest period of detention experienced by a person on Angel Island was by a woman named Kwak Shi, who spent almost 2 years in detention at Angel Island and ultimately was deported back to China.
Was there a reason for that?
The immigration officials just didn't believe that she was one of the excluded classes that would allow her to enter into the US. And it was difficult. It was more difficult often for women to immigrate to the US because there were fewer career opportunities for women back then. And there was this concept of what's called LPC, or likely to be a public charge, where if an immigrant is thought to potentially require assistance or be dependent on the government to be able to sustain themselves in the US, and they were deemed likely to be a public charge. And so women, particularly Asian women, if they were traveling single, had a harder time entering the US.
Understand. Back to the poetry for a minute. I know there are several books that have been written that have the poetry in them. It's anthologies, if you will, and I guess a wonderful way to memorialize what took place. Again, I know we were talking earlier, and I call it a story of hope and heartbreak that you hear in some of that poetry. Can you tell us a little bit about how those books came about and maybe how people can get a hold of some of those books that have the poetry in them?
The poems are so beautiful and eloquent, and they're all written in Chinese. So unless you speak Chinese, it's hard to understand the emotions and themes of what's written in the walls at Angel Island. There have been a number of books that have been published over the years. One of the first ones was a book called Island that was by Hinmark Lai, by Jenny Lim, and Judy Young. And that poem documents many of the Chinese poems that were carved into the barracks and helps provide translations to them to make them more accessible to those of us who don't speak Chinese. In subsequent years, and even more recently, Professor Charles Egan has done a significant amount of work to also look at some of the other inscriptions that are carved into Angel Island's walls. So the Chinese were the only group that carved poems into the walls, but there are inscriptions, most often a name and date or where someone was from, that are inscribed into the walls at Angel Island. And those include inscriptions in Korean, in Japanese, in Punjabi, in Russian, in Spanish. And so Professor Egan, in his latest book, which just came out last year called Voices, helps to make those poems more accessible to people who don't speak those languages.
Well, that's great. I know I've enjoyed reading those poems over the years. They certainly speak to me. It's it's just a wonderful story, continuing story of immigration in this country, particularly in light of what's happening on our southern border, as open and welcoming as this country is. Of course, all countries have immigration laws, and it's tough for people going to new countries. And the story of the immigration station there in Angel Island is certainly representative of the continuing struggle, I guess, of human beings to find their place in this world, not just in this country, but get a sense of belonging. And I think Angel Island certainly tells that story. So what's the future now of Angel Island and the immigration station? What kind of programs do you have planned for the future?
It's a really exciting time for Angel Island. The opening of the new Angel Island Immigration Museum marks an important chapter in a 40-year dream to preserve some of the major buildings at the island. And so now that that building has been open to the public for the first time as of January this year, it provides us continued opportunities to conduct programs in person as well as virtually that help tell the stories that are connected to Angel Island, to connect those stories to immigration that's happening today, because there are many parallels. Like you said, Don, what's happening on the southern border today in terms of the detention is very reminiscent of what happened at Angel Island. There was definitely family separation that happened at Angel Island. There were children who were in detention at Angel Island. And so we are seeing history repeat itself, unfortunately. And so the hope for the Angel Island Immigration Station Foundation, as we partner with California State Parks, both in continuing to preserve the site as well as uplifting the history of Angel Island, is that we can continue to reach out to people who aren't familiar with Angel Island's history and the importance it has in our countries, both in our psyche, the country's psyche, as well as we think about how we treat the people who live in the U.S. How do we treat people who come to the U.S. and how do we think of immigrants not as a burden on our communities, but as a wonderful wealth of new ideas, new opportunities, and new cultures that make our country stronger.
Absolutely. Well, Edward Tiphorn, thank you for joining us on Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves and telling us about your journey and about the journey of so many immigrants and hopeful individuals who came to this country and now are part of this country. And as you say, working to make this an even stronger country and to help all of us realize the American dream and realize what liberty really means to all human beings. Thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you so much, Don. And if anyone is interested in learning more about Angel Island, they can visit our website at www.aiisf.org in order to learn about some of the different books that have been written about Angel Island, to learn more about its history, or to plan your next visit to come out and visit in person.
Well, we'll also have all of this information on our website. So when we broadcast this podcast, you can go to lifeisastorypodcast.com as well, and we'll have a whole page on Angel Island where people can find out more information as well. Again, Ed, thanks for joining us, and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
What a story of hope, heartbreak, and finally inspiration. Thank you all for joining us on this episode of Life is a Story We Tell Ourselves. Please subscribe to the podcast at lifeisastorypodcast.com, and you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We conclude this episode with one of the poems written on the barrack walls of the Angel Island Immigration Station, written by Smiley John. When I left, my parents regretted it was so hurried. The reason I tearfully swallowed my resentment is because of poverty. Wishing to escape permanent poverty, I fled overseas. Who caused my destiny to be so perverse that I would become imprisoned? The victim of aggression, people of our nation mourn the desperate times. I feel sorely guilty for having not repaid my parents' kindness. Grieving the cold night, the insects now make noise. Not only do I sob silently, but my throat tastes bitter. Stay safe, share happiness, and remember, never stop questioning. Curiosity has its own reason for existing.